This is the IBJ podcast for the week of May 5th, 2025, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. In the early hours of Friday, April 25th, Indiana legislators passed a $44 billion budget for state expenses over the next 2 years, specifically from July 1st, 2025 to June 30th, 2027. Legislators knew going in that state revenue to fund the budget would be tight, and they got a nasty revenue forecast with about a week to go in the session. The last week of a budget writing session is usually pretty hectic, and this one had plenty of surprises as lawmakers tried to find ways to generate more tax revenue while simultaneously reducing funding for agencies and departments. Fledgling Governor Mike Braun jumped headfirst into his first legislative session and made progress on his campaign promise to provide property tax relief. The Republican-led General Assembly also passed legislation aimed at lowering healthcare costs for Hoosiers with an approach that focused on hospitals. In both of those cases, of course, the bills passed were the product of much debate, lobbying, negotiation, and compromise. Lawmakers also entered the session knowing that reforms would be proposed for the Indiana Economic Development Corp, the state agency charged with helping attract businesses to Indiana and helping businesses currently in the state grow. Its fate wasn't entirely decided until very late in the session. Some legislators were concerned with the veil of secrecy under which the IEDC conducts some of its business. Governor Braun has repeatedly emphasized the need for transparency in state government. Ironically, language affecting the governance of Indiana University was quietly inserted in the budget bill at the last minute, changing rules for faculty tenure and giving Braun complete control of choosing the members of the IU Board of Trustees. Braun has defended the policy move, which didn't receive a public hearing before the budget passed. Legislative leaders have refused to say who suggested the language, and Braun has said that it, quote, came collectively from folks in the legislature, unquote. To take stock of the latest budget writing session and how it will affect Hoosiers, we've invited a panel of reporters who covered some or all of the General Assembly to share their insights on fiscal issues and a few surprises. From the Indianapolis Business Journal, we have Kate Sharon and Daniel Lee, and they're joined by Casey Smith of Indiana Capital Chronicle. Here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel for today's discussion. I'm going to have everybody say hi and then where they went to high school, just so listeners can get a fix on your voices. So first up, we have IBJ State House reporter Kate Sharon, who covered the legislative session from start to finish. Thank you for making time, Kate.
Hi. Yeah. And you want to know where I went to Metro Detroit. Do I need to be more specific than this?
I need your mascot.
Oh, the Falcons and the Blazers. I went to two different high schools. So.
Okay. That's cool. We won't get into that today. Yeah. Next up, we have IBJ healthcare reporter Dan Lee, who focused specifically on legislation intended to reduce healthcare costs in Indiana this session. Dan, welcome back.
Thanks a lot, Mason. I went to Hampton High School in Allison Park, Pennsylvania, home of the Hampton Talbots, which is a beagle-like extinct English hunting dog.
That's a sad story.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's kind of a sad tale of the Hampton Talbot, but we try to keep its spirit alive.
Okay, thank you. Batting cleanup, we have Casey Smith of the Indiana Capital Chronicle, which specializes in state government reporting. IBJ readers likely have read some of Casey's coverage since the Chronicle very generously allows us to post their stories. Casey, it is great to have you back on the podcast. Where'd you go to high school?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I am from Indianapolis, so I went to high school on the south side, Southport High School, home of the Cardinals.
Right on.
Yes, and I went on to be a Cardinal at Ball State afterwards, so double Cardinal.
That's amazing. And you have a master's?
Yes, I went to California, to University of California, Berkeley for that. So unfortunately not an Indiana school, but I'm back.
Okay.
So
we'll keep it on the down low there.
Yes.
And of course, I am a graduate of Broad Ripple High School. Go Rockets. Let's start at the end of the 4-month budget writing process. If you want to look at the budget in broad strokes, nearly half of that money is dedicated to K through 12 education. 22% funds Medicaid, 9% funds higher ed, 8% funds health and human services, 6% funds the government itself, corrections accounts for 5%, and public safety, 2%. Sounds fairly simple, but it's not. Legislators talk about the budget throughout the session, but a lot happens in the last couple of weeks to determine how much will be spent and how we're going to pay for it. Plus, many seemingly unrelated initiatives can find themselves inserted at the last second into the budget bill. So my impression is that lawmakers already expected a very tight budget at the beginning of the session, but they got an ugly surprise on April 16th. What happened? Casey, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, so the state, we do budget forecasts in December and April. So we already knew back in December that we were going to have, like you said, a tight budget. This session, we set a budget every 2 years, and this was a budget setting session. So we kind of tiptoed in committees with a lot of bills, around a lot of bills for the first few months of session, because there was this lingering big question of, well, what is the April forecast going to show? Are we going to be kind of where we thought we were going to be in December? Is it going to be worse? Is it going to be way worse? I don't think anybody thought it was going to be better, and leadership consistently said we do not expect what we had 2 years back, where we kind of had a big positive surprise, like, oh, hey, we have extra dollars we can work with in the budget. Like, nobody was expecting that to happen. So we got, of course, to mid-April, and when we got the budget forecast, it was dismal as expected. And so there were more cuts that had to be made really right before the end of session to the budget. So it was kind of a scramble there at the end. We already had a tight budget, but they had to tighten up even more. So there were questions on the table. Is K-12 funding going to take some sort of hit here? What does this mean for healthcare? What does this mean for having to get other sources of revenue? And I'm sure we're going to talk about it. That's how the cigarette tax ended up on the table, in a really serious way. I mean, there were all sorts of things on the table there at kind of at the end. At one point, I don't remember what committee it was. I think it was a Democrat who even brought it up. They were like, let's do a fireworks tax. I mean, like, everything was kind of on the table. I was like, whoa, I haven't heard that in a while. So it was, yeah, I mean, session, like, legally didn't actually have to come to a close until there were several more days, but leadership had been saying for several weeks, or at least hinting at, that they wanted to end a few days early, which is what they always do, like on a Thursday. And then sure enough, we were there until the wee hours Friday, wrapping this thing up. But they did it. But there were cuts, and there were some new taxes. So
Kate, specifically, what was the shortfall? Like, they expected X amount of money, and then they realized, oh boy, we're in a hole.
Yeah, so state revenue is heavily dependent on income taxes as well as sales tax. So income has been slowing since the pandemic. There was a really big jump, as Casey mentioned, but it's been starting to slow, and it's been slowing over the next few years. So that was expected. That's why they were kind of like, these numbers are not as great as, our last budget crafting session. But really kind of with some of the economic uncertainty, that's really brought down those numbers in that forecast. I know the forecast that they rely on, it's bipartisan or nonpartisan, and they really pointed to tariffs, economic uncertainty, kind of the bond market as reasons why there was such a big dip from our last forecast in December until April. So it'll be $2.4 billion over the next 3 years. $2 billion is in that next budget. So that's really where, they had to cut $2 billion out of their previous two spending plans that were passed by the House and Senate. So that's really where big changes in the last week of session.
So essentially, they say, hey, we got this big 340-page budget bill, but now we have $2 billion less to spend. Mm-hmm. So what's up?
We also didn't have a couple years back, we had the federal COVID dollars that were kind of a boost. And so we didn't have that. This was our first time around not having those COVID dollars in place. So I think that was part of it as well.
So what did lawmakers do specifically to cover the expected gap, or the unexpected gap, I guess specifically? What did they come up with, Casey?
There were some some additional cuts to like public health funding than what had been previously put into the earlier drafts of the budget. Obviously, we had that $2 cigarette tax that went in that was also not there previously.
And tell us about what that is. We had been taxing cigarettes at $1 a pack.
Just shy $1, I think.
Like for a long time.
Yeah, long time. There had been a lot of resistance for a long time from lawmakers to touch that. And so there we saw in that final draft of the budget that $2 additional tax. So not $2, a $2 additional tax. So now we're right around $3 now per pack.
Is that something they'd be keeping in their back pocket for like an emergency? I mean, what was it that this time they said, well, we got to do cigarettes?
We've been asking leadership about this for years, especially during budget cycles. And there had been a lot of, lobbying from certain groups to up that tax as a form of not just revenue, but also just from a public health standpoint to reduce, tobacco use in Indiana. When we asked again at the end of the session, I think there was kind of a little bit of a change of tune of, it was always, on the table. We've been open to it. We've talked about it. So maybe it was in the back pocket, but definitely, if it wasn't before April, it got put in the back pocket pretty quick, and they did pull it out.
Yeah, it was like in case of emergency break glass.
Yeah, I'll tell you what they didn't touch though. That had also there were serious conversations around, and what it sounded like back rooms was the alcohol tax as well, which has long been untouched. Also, so we were also potentially expecting, well, maybe they'll do a lighter increase on the cigarette tax, but also do kind of a light increase too on the alcohol tax, but they did not touch the alcohol tax. They went all in on cigarettes. So
they expect the cigarette tax to bring in over the biennium, the 2-year period, how much?
About $800 million, because there's also a small chunk of that is also other tobacco products like cigars, and I think chewing tobacco as well are also going to see a proportional tax increase as well to like what the $2 is for cigarettes. So they'll also, I think it's like $25 million a year. So it'll be around, almost, not exactly half of that, shortfall, but getting towards that. So that definitely softened the blow quite a bit.
And there were cuts pretty much across the board, right? I mean, just through government operations, agencies, departments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, higher ed too in there took a little bit of a deeper cut than expected. That was another not super significant in terms of overall budget, but that was another area that got, like I said, cut a little deeper. What did not get cut though, that was a little surprising, I will say, is our voucher system in the state, K-12 voucher system, is already very robust. It was nearly universal, but they did put they removed the income cap on that program, and so they still managed to fit that in.
For people who don't have kids.
Yeah, so these are it's the India's voucher system allows parents of any K-12 student to get a voucher from the state to use to pay for education at a private school in Indiana. It's the idea of the dollar follows the child instead of the dollars go to the school. So previously, before the last session, 2 years ago, they did a big, they boosted the dollars to that program significantly to raise the income ceiling for a family of four to, I think before this budget it was like roughly $220,000 a year for a family of four. So now there's no income cap. A family can make $40,000, a family can make, $4 million a year, and their child can access that voucher.
Yeah. Previously, I'm sorry if you just said this. Previously, it was $220,000, I think, for the total family income.
Yep.
That was the ceiling for receiving the voucher.
Which was still like 90%. So that like 90% of like the students' families in the state qualified at that point. So this just added that other 10% on top.
Yeah. And then, as somebody who makes less than half that, it's a little bewildering, to think, well, these folks, need help with private education. Why has that been a priority for the legislature?
I mean, so we have a supermajority in the legislature, Republican supermajority, and a big piece of at least, in this state, the Republican agenda has been like parental choice, and that includes parents' choice as to where their child goes to school. That includes private schools. And so that was an agenda item for Governor Braun. This was his first legislative session, so that was on his agenda. It's been a goal for Republicans in the state house for years to get the choice scholarship, that's the voucher system in the state, to fully universal. They want to be a leader in the country. Indiana is a leader now. Going fully universal, we're among the first states to do that at this point. So that's been a known goal for years now at this point.
So, but even in a very, very tight and then an even more tight legislative session, this was a priority.
Clearly, there had been discussions, especially in that last week after the budget forecast, of are budget writers going to be able to keep that in the budget, because it was not. The Senate, I believe the Senate took it out. The House version had it. Senate was more conservative in their budget writing, but the compromise budget they made it fit.
Okay. I'm going to do a quick callback to a podcast we did probably 2 years ago with Luke Kenley about the program that was essentially adopted, in which the state government would supply additional funding to county health departments, and that they had figured out, if we can provide extra funding on a county by county level, I mean, this can help solve a lot of the problems that we're having health-wise in the state, and healthier people spend less money on healthcare. That, I think, had been funded at $100 million a year, and then that got cut to $40 million. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Just for folks who've been going through their old IBJ podcast episodes. That is what happened to that program. How about examples of how legislation slipped into the budget bill, or a language slipped in the budget bill? I know there was a last minute addition. Maybe you can even give me a number of hours before the budget was approved that it appeared, that would give Governor Braun complete control over choosing the members of the Indiana University Board of Trustees. Kate, do you recall when that became known?
Yeah, so that was, I think, when they released the budget on, was it Wednesday? It was after they actually posted the language, like probably around 6 p.m. on Wednesday. So there was a press briefing with reporters that didn't get brought up during that meeting. But we also didn't know to ask about that because we didn't realize that was on the table. From my memory, that was not introduced in any bills this session. Definitely not one that had a committee hearing. So that was definitely something that kind of jumped out at the last moment. I think Axios broke that story Thursday morning that was included. So yeah, that inclusion essentially takes away Indiana University alumni their ability to vote for 3 members of the Board of Trustees. Obviously, the Board of Trustees has been a talking point recently.
9-member board.
Yes, 9-member board. And IU, we don't have to get into it, but IU's had some, national news focus on them with how they've dealt with, Palestinian protests on campus and with Pamela Whitten specifically. So there's been increased scrutiny over that board and over how President Whitten has kind of conducted business on campus. So where this came from, we don't really know. Lawmakers asked their colleagues over and over again where this came from. We didn't really get a solid answer. But yeah.
And Casey, you had a story just this morning about the reaction from some alumni. Can you recap that for us quickly?
Yeah, and then I'll flash back for a second. Yeah, we got the budget that Wednesday night, so roughly just a little more than 24 hours before the budget actually got voted out. That immediately, that language stood out. There was that Board of Trustees language, and then there was additionally some other language in the budget related to changing how university faculty, how tenure is decided. And it's...
Yeah, and I believe that it would be... what's the word I'm looking for? That you'd be evaluated as a tenure Professor, by your productivity.
Yes, which this was a couple things on this. Typically the budget is you've got numbers in it, right? It's who's getting what state dollars. It's fairly unprecedented. I'm not saying it hasn't happened in the past. It has, but you really don't see additions like this into a budget. Typically, this type of language appears first in other bills that get vetted, typically go through the committee process. The public has a chance to testify, and speak about what's being proposed. There are votes in both sides of both chambers. We didn't have that here, and it happened so last minute. So that stood out immediately Wednesday. Since then, we have asked the governor and lawmakers, where did this language come from? The governor just told us yesterday that it didn't come from him, that it originated within circles of lawmakers. He didn't give specifics, but he said that he definitely wasn't opposed to it, clearly. So
what are the chances it was ChatGPT?
It's a little specific. So
okay.
There were clearly some, I think if I had to, based on what I've heard, it was probably discussed behind the scenes for a little bit, but there was maybe some strategy there putting it in at the end, obviously. Since then, there's been a lot of pushback from the IU Alumni Association. They just released a letter yesterday where a couple dozen past chairs of that alumni association have really spoken out against that language. Some of those folks who signed that letter too were former trustees themselves for IU. Like I said, the governor has defended the decision. He has cited the governor and Republican leadership in the State House have cited the fact that those three trustee members who at IU are currently voted in by the alumni, the participation in those votes, the alumni votes, has been, I think the governor said yesterday, it's been
single digits, I think.
Single digits, less than 2%. I've not fully vetted that, but we've heard that over and over again from the governor and Republicans that's not a very representative of the alumni of the university, and
so they're better off with one person deciding.
Well, the governor does decide. The governor already decides the others on the board, and then at other public universities across the state, the governor has similar, if not full, control over decisions of those board members as well. So that's also been cited as well. We're just kind of evening the playing field here, kind of making the process even across the board. But still, lots of concerns have been raised by alumni, Democrats in the State House those final hours. I mean, they were also very upset because this language, like I said, it came up at the very end. It wasn't something that was able to be discussed. We heard a lot of that on the floor as the budget, before the budget was being voted out. Not happy with the process. And that was something that, Republican leadership said before the start of the session, that they wanted to, have a more, not just transparent process and how legislation moves out, but more opportunities, increased opportunities for folks to be heard in committees and for things not to kind of pop up last minute. So this was kind of counter to that promise.
Yeah, that was the thing that sounded very discordant to me. When they spent so much time discussing how we need a greater transparency in state government, for this to sort of crop up and affect something that I don't know how many adults in Indiana went to Indiana University, but I'm going to say it's in the millions. It just sounds sort of absurd. Is this a practice that happens at every budget writing session, that there's always something that gets inserted to just sort of out of the blue?
Not like this into the budget. I mean, sure, the last week or two of session, when you get into these conference committees, language that either appeared to be dead earlier in the session comes back. It's not uncommon for brand new language to appear. Obviously, there's a lot of criticism when that happens. It's not unheard of, but for language like this to come into the budget bill at the very end, that was kind of surprising. I personally was surprised that it didn't end up in another education. There were education bills that were still pending in the last 24, 36 hours of session. But that's not where that language ended up. It went into the budget.
Okay. Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with the latest episode of the IBJ Podcast. Let's get back to our panel discussion on the 2025 Indiana General Assembly. I see Dan way over there. Hi, Dan. I'm going to transition to the legislature's attempt to tamp down healthcare costs for consumers by putting some restrictions, and you can, I'm sure, come up with better language than this, on the state's nonprofit hospital systems. So let me explain how I see this real quick, and then you can disabuse me of this. And you wrote about this several times this year. The issue of rising healthcare costs is fascinating to me. And whenever people in government say, hey, we need to lower healthcare costs for consumers, you know the obstacles they're going to hit. I mean, the main problem in my mind is that healthcare in America is this tangle of independent but still intertwined industries. You have the hospitals, and there are hospitals in metro areas, and then there are hospitals in rural areas, and they have different finances and they have different needs. You have insurance companies. You have the employers who offer insurance coverage to their workers. There are different kinds of insurance policies. There are medical device companies. There are pharmaceutical firms. You have the intermediaries between the pharmaceutical firms and the consumer, and so on and so on. And it seems, tell me if I'm wrong, no one in this ecosystem is interested in shouldering the majority of the burden for lowering costs. And every industry has lobbyists that says, hey, we are doing our best to lower costs. But Indiana legislators in this session decided to focus on hospitals. Why focus on hospitals?
Yes, well, really, we're talking about House Bill 1004 here specifically. And really the driving force behind this bill was really commercial insurance paid by workers, but really by employers. Because if you work for a company, a big company particularly, and you get health insurance, you may not like the premiums you're paying, but your employer is actually paying the majority of that premium. You see estimates probably 75, 80% of the premium. And what's more, many large employers, like your Fortune 500 companies or what they call big enterprises, would pay like what's called self-pay. So they pay their healthcare bills. They're not really purchasing insurance, like risk, like we may win if we have a healthy population. They're paying their employees' bills versus putting the risk onto someone else, the insurance company. Yeah. And Indiana has a lot of those, more than average states. And so it's really groups from this bill. It's something that's been going on for 5 years or so, driven by groups like the Employers Forum of Indiana. There's a new nonprofit or a new advocacy group called Hoosiers for Affordable Health Care that have really been, pointing out that Indiana's hospital prices appear, according to studies that they've kind of helped commission and other studies, higher than average. And that's really where this came from. And a lot of our healthcare system kind of operates on the idea of some cost shifting, where hospitals do make more money from, people with Anthem or United Healthcare, obviously, than they do with people covered by public programs, like Medicaid or even Medicare. And so there's a lot of controversy about that. But like the Indiana Manufacturers Association and some others would point out that they talk to companies that have, facilities in multiple states, like other Midwest states, and that it costs more by thousands a year to have an employee covered by healthcare in Indiana than, say, Michigan or something.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So they started off small, what we objectively can consider small, with what I believe a 4-page bill.
Yeah. So I wrote stories on this. I'd have to add up, but it was probably like 8 or 9 stories. And the first story was like one of those in like the afternoon, you write in like an hour and a half at your desk in the newsroom. And by the end, I'm like monitoring the live stream for 12 hours, writing this bill. And like the biggest story I did on this, which I think was the longest story I've written here. I noted that the bill grew from like 4 pages to 133 by the time it passed the Senate. And as we were just talking about for half an hour, the state budget at that point was 175 pages, and that ran the whole state. And so, I likened it, the metaphor I used was like, these advocates, when you start tinkering with our healthcare system, particularly these hospital systems that are multi-billion-dollar operations with tens of thousands of employees and many different types of businesses, it gets really complex really quick.
Right. And we have what they call the Big Five.
Yes. And, initially the legislation did not specify that, but then that language was added in. And the Big Five was defined as like more than $2 billion in net patient revenue in Indiana. And it really is the, IU Health, Ascension St. Vincent, Community Health Network, St. Francis, and then Parkview up in Fort Wayne, which is interesting because I went to multiple hearings over at the State House on this, and, the hospitals brought in to testify were small rural hospitals in often difficult situations, which is a very legitimate issue. But none of the Big Five publicly testified.
Why not?
They, I think they prefer, to work through like the Indiana Hospital Association.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the industry. The industry
advocacy lobbying group, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
And so how did it go from 4 to what was it? 130?
133.
133.
And then I think it's come back down.
It sounds like there's a lot of lobbyists involved. Somewhere. So
it passed, and it's before the governor. And I think I read that he's going to take action on it by Tuesday. Okay. It said on his website. And, I think that they started refining the complexities and trying to target it. And certainly it was being put through the process. I'm a business reporter, not so much a legislative reporter, so I'm searching for all the terminology. But through the lobbying and through the vetting process, the influences that happened to a bill, it got more complex, and it really fundamentally changed. And it also started to take in some aspects, other parts of healthcare. There were some things done in it to kind of maximize Medicaid reimbursement. There was efforts to put scrutiny on health insurance companies. And there was a good bit of kind of debate, even among the Republicans, over this idea of, because the legislation sought to threaten to strip nonprofit status and or at times, impose financial penalties or an excise tax on hospitals if they hit certain price thresholds. And those were kind of pegged at percentage of Medicare reimbursement, hundreds of, whether it was 200, 300%, 260%.
The prices for a procedure.
For procedure.
So knee replacement.
It could be like a common, no birth is common, but like a uncomplicated birth. Or an appendicitis, or a complex treatment for pneumonia with comorbidities. Any of these have like what's called like a DRG, where they get like a certain payment from Medicare, and pretty much all the reimbursements are kind of pegged off of that. As they do these negotiations.
Right. So they're looking at initially we're looking at what the national averages were for these reimbursements. And they're saying, okay, if you go over, a certain level of this average, we are going to look at taking away your not-for-profit status.
Yeah. So when it was kind of leaving the House, it started there. I believe it was like 260% if you're over that. And at first it started with any procedure, which could be thousands. Then it went to aggregate procedure, costs. But it was like 260 would trigger like a tax. And then at 300, there would be a loss of nonprofit. And then once it got into the Senate, that eventually changed.
Now, what did they end up with?
So they ended up with, now it's not going to really go into full action until the end of June of 2029. They're going to study it, the Office of Budget Management, but it's really based on they're going to establish inpatient and outpatient state revenue or state average prices, aggregate average prices. And so it's going to be if you're above that, you could be at it or below it. If you're above it, you would lose your nonprofit status for a year, or it's said until you come into compliance. And then there's some other features of the bill. They have to file with the Department of Health increased transparency numbers from like their nonprofit form 990s. If they miss that by like the October deadline, they could face a fine of, or they would face a fine of $10,000 a day, which is a lot, but these are also multi-billion-dollar organizations. So there's some other measures. There's some increased transparency required of like insurance companies or third-party administrators, which is like if a company's going self-pay for their healthcare, they would hire an administrator, could be Anthem or someone else, who basically processes their claims. In fact, if you have an Anthem card, you can look on the back and it'll say if it's a TPA or not, which is kind of interesting to know for consumers.
So here's the thing that struck me. Tell me if I'm interpreting this right. So initially they were looking at national averages.
Right.
And then in the end, they're going to construct averages based on how much people pay in Indiana.
Right.
But the big five hospital systems, in great part, are responsible for establishing those aggregates.
Correct.
Because they're the ones who actually determine what the averages would be.
I'd like to dig into that issue a little bit more because it reminded me there were, in my previous journalism career, I had developed something of a niche of covering executive compensation. And one of the things I would say about like CEO compensation was they would always peg it off of peer CEOs. So it kind of becomes a very helpful rising tide of all boats. So I don't know. Yeah, that's a very good point. And it kind of is very different from the initial intent of the bill was to bring us to really look at national averages versus Indiana, where then it became much more internal.
Okay. And have any critics of the bill talked about what they like or don't like about it?
Yes, it was interesting. Even Governor Braun in one of his press conferences, talked about the lobby power of insurance and hospitals and talked about some of that it's an issue in Indiana, these prices. And that he also said it was a good start, I think, referring to the bill. So I don't know what he's going to do with it.
It's a good start.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was certainly some pretty robust debate on the Senate and House floors. Some philosophical things over. There was I would think a major debate over some Republicans saying that these nonprofits need to act like nonprofits, and in many cases they're not. And then there were other people who were saying they just did not like the idea of price caps or price punishing, kind of going against free market principles, and that's something that deep blue states would do. So there was a good, but overall the bill seemed to have decent support. It passed by a decent margin out of both houses.
Let's talk about something simple like property taxes. Property tax relief was a major priority for Mike Braun, I think during his campaign, at least a portion of the campaign, and then as governor. And those initiatives were placed in what we call Senate Bill number 1, which I intuit is numbered to indicate it is the most important thing to the governor or to somebody having that honorary number 1 status. What did Governor Braun initially propose in terms of property tax relief?
So, as someone who doesn't own a home, I had to learn a lot about property taxes. But Governor Braun's initial bill was very focused on widespread and an intense amount of relief. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it would be billions of dollars cut from homeowners' bills. And then property taxes are a local tax, so all of that goes to local governments, schools, counties. So, a lot of that money of how your city or county, like what they operate off of, that comes from property taxes. So he was proposing pretty significant cuts. A tax bill cap was one of the primary things, and then also targeted demographic relief for seniors, for example, and then veterans and a few other vulnerable groups. So when he first debuted this proposal, it was definitely took a lot of people by shock, because that would shock the whole system. Throughout this entire process, Governor Braun and then lawmakers have said that local governments need to tighten their belts just as other levels of government will need to as well. But there was a lot of pushback from local government leaders, mayors who came to the State House saying, this is too much. This will be a multi-million-dollar, decrease in, smaller communities as well as, some of the largest like Carmel.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm sure bring up public safety. This is going to hurt fire. This is going to hurt police.
Oh, yeah. The pushback from locals was very strong from the onset. We heard this is going to be a big cut to schools. We started to see that in some of the initial numbers that had come out at the onset, that it was going to be millions and millions of dollars lost to schools across the state. We heard public safety. We heard ambulance services. We heard, anything that your local government services that are provided, those are going to be reduced or eliminated altogether. And that was a very swift and broad pushback from municipal leadership. But on the inverse of that, we had, homeowners and renters too. Folks who are affected by these tax bills coming out, testifying at committees. There was the giant, property tax rally at the State House mid-session where, that really just ramped things up even more, saying, hey, these bills are getting out of hand. Like, we got to do something. But yeah.
And as I remember, that Governor Braun, would bring up, the many people he would speak with on the campaign trail who would go right to him and say, hey, my property taxes are too high. I can't afford to live here.
Mm-hmm. There's always been people who have been anti-property tax. Like, even at that rally, so during the pandemic.
On principle.
Yes. During the pandemic, assessed values went up a ton, which is why we're seeing that this increase now. Some experts are saying that's going to go down. So they argued maybe we don't need to make drastic changes in the property tax system. But really, with Braun taking this, kind of taking the mantle on this, and he went to that property tax rally where there was a lot of people saying we shouldn't have to pay property taxes at all. So I think that there was always maybe a silent base that was always really pushing really hard for this. So once, Governor Braun took this as his number one issue, and really ran with that, he had a lot of people that were supporting that. And then that's kind of where he's run into trouble after, when this bill keeps getting pared down to where we are right now, where people are arguing, this is still going to have a pretty intense impact on budgeting for local governments in the future, and they might have to look at other avenues for revenue growth, including the local income tax, as well as people saying this is not enough. We can get more into the specifics.
Yeah. So I recall, there was a lot of give and take, let's say, in the middle of the session between lawmakers who appeared to be swayed that, this might be too intense.
Yeah, they were saying on the floor, I am hearing from my constituents. They are freaking out. They are not happy. So their hands were tied.
Yeah,
it was tough.
Senate Republicans largely backed away from the significant parts of Braun's plan. Eventually, there's I don't know if come to Jesus is the right way to put it, but let's get together in a room. Let's hammer out a plan we can agree on. So how can we encapsulate the final plan here?
Oh, I can take this one.
Okay.
I basically became the property tax reporter for a while. But so we saw three major iterations of the property tax bill. So three different iterations of a property tax system. And what we ended up with is, in part, a major proposal that Representative Jeff Thompson has been working on for years. So part one of this tax bill, or this Senate Bill 1, is tax reform. So we are moving our tax system away from a levy-based system to one that's focused on our constitutional caps, or the circuit breaker of 1%. So under this new bill, it'll be easier to understand your tax rate. So most tax rates, you're not going to see a tax rate of over 3%, but you could still see your bill go up because there's a lot happening behind the scenes. So under this bill, if you are being taxed at a 3% rate for your property taxes, everyone in your county who's a homeowner will hit that circuit breaker of 1%, the most that you will be hitting, after your assessed value. So that is one thing. It's going to make your tax system easier because we kind of have the levy-based system, which is, it's a little complicated, but, it's a city has or a county has a levy of how much that they can charge, and then they divvy it up based on assessed value and how many taxpayers are in their constituency. And then part 2, which was added on. So we have that tax reform base. You look like you want to ask me something.
No.
No, okay.
I'm with you.
So the first part was very focused on reforming the system so we have a better system to move forward with. Jeff Thompson has repeatedly called the system broken and saying that you need to fix it in order to make not just keep putting Band-Aids on the issue. However, this didn't cause a lot of savings. There was some savings in there, but people are saying this is not enough. And it was also extremely complicated. So there is a complicated plan that when you look at the fiscal analysis doesn't give homeowners much saving. So the compromise that was reached with Governor Braun was to have a $300 credit or 10% credit that would be applied to your final bill. So if you hit that circuit breaker of 1% and your home is a certain assessed value, you will have $300 less than that. It also allows for seniors and different vulnerable populations like disabled veterans to also have deductions that they previously had turned into credits. So basically, someone would be like, what does that mean? You'll get more savings out of a credit at the end than you would a deduction. So there's some more there's widespread relief in this plan, which is kind of where the hang-up is. It's hard to have widespread relief without causing really significant cuts to local government. But then there's also some more targeted demographic relief, specifically for seniors, because one thing we heard throughout session is we don't want grandma to lose her home. And so really in this plan, that's what the focus was, is making sure that she doesn't lose her home, but then everyone across the board will have relief in some form. And at the end of the day, lawmakers say 2/3 of homeowners will have cheaper bills in 2026 than 2025.
There you go. That's the one I understand.
Yeah.
Republicans say 2/3 of homeowners will pay a lower property tax bill in 2026 than they will this year. And for most people, it will be $300 or less.
Around there. It also heavily depends on what counties do with their tax rate. Likely they're going to try to get the same amount. And also they could, I did a story a few weeks back, maybe a month ago at this point, but this is also going to prompt a major conversation among local governments of the diversity of their income sources, their revenue sources. Mm-hmm. So, maybe we could see property taxes have traditionally been a very stable form of revenue where local income tax and income taxes in general can fluctuate based on the economy. Obviously, there's fears that we're approaching a recession that could make relying on, income taxes a little bit more difficult. But at this point in time, this conversation is being forced. They have to consider those things. So we could see, local income taxes go up. You could see your property tax bill go down significantly, but then also see your local income taxes rise.
Which was some of the pushback. That was some of the pushback at the end there was,
yeah. Well,
it's not guaranteed. I mean, it's not guaranteed. And that's what we heard from Republicans is it's up to locals to decide if they're going to do more with the local income tax. So they kind of pushed that ball down the court a little bit to locals, but I think that became part of the big conversation.
But income taxes is where they most likely would make it up.
Yeah.
They would increase income taxes for their residents.
Or cut services was the other.
Or cut services, right. And then, and some are obviously contemplating both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of those things, like if local governments were to, with the amount that they'd be losing with this, when I've talked to local government officials, they're saying, you might notice, garbage not being picked up as much in your local parks, or they're not able to, go after a major capital project or do a major parks project. And you may still see that over the next few years. Local government leaders are saying that they're trying to, make their budgets as vanilla as possible because this is phasing in. This isn't just like tomorrow or July 1st, everything is happening. No, this is going to take years of, you're not going to see your local income tax raise next year. You're probably going to see that, 2028, 2029. But you're going to see your taxes go down next year. So this is going to be a continuous thing. You might see some changes in your government services. You also might see more education efforts by your local government, leaders who are trying to say, okay, your property taxes are going to go down, but we have to raise your local income tax by, 0.5%. And for some context on that, the bill also pared down how much local governments can charge with their local income tax. They were at like 3.75, I believe. They're now at 2.9%. And what's new is that
statewide, that's
yes. And right now, it's not that most places are not hitting that cap. I think the average is 1.72%. So every county is already charging a local income tax. If you look at your paycheck, you're already going to be seeing some money be taken out. But there could be some conversations there of, how are we going to use this new tool because there's an extra emphasis put on it. And also cities within that 2.9% can have their own rate of 1.2%. So cities are going to have this new capability unlocked where they can charge part of that 2.9%. Counties have that part as well. They have 1.2%. One big asterisk to this whole conversation is schools cannot charge their own local income tax rate. And schools, I would say, were probably one of the biggest losers in this bill. They're going to be losing property tax revenue. Senate Bill 519, is that it? 518?
It was 5 something. Yeah.
I was going to say there's a property tax sharing bill or revenue sharing bill with charter schools and public schools that was amended into this bill. Some of the more thorny parts of that bill were amended out. But that also kind of goes back to that budget conversation where schools are going to have to see they're going to have to forecast and see what they have to work with because they're going to see less property tax revenue. They're going to have to share more of it with charter schools. And there's vouchers that kind of get thrown into the mix with their state funding.
What does that mean to renters? I mean, am I at the mercy of my landlord? My landlord might be paying less property taxes for that property, but he or she isn't necessarily going to pass that along to me.
I don't know. I think that's still to be seen.
I think, that was the argument too, from renters, but especially the concern about if the savings would be passed down or if there weren't going to be, if there were still going to be, there was the conversation about, at one point, the tax bills, it was going to be a decrease to the increase. And so that really especially like renters come out and they were like, well, the increases, like those are going to be passed on immediately to us. And like the bill doesn't, that was one of the criticisms of the bill, right? Is that it doesn't specifically target like renter groups to ensure that they do get some of the savings get passed down to them. Now, in terms of Senate Enrolled Act 1, and lawmakers have said about that. They could come back next year or in 2 years and still make tweaks to this. And then on the renter front too, they said, hey, we may be coming back. We're likely going to come back in the next year or two and take a closer look at that. So it didn't happen this year. I will say, though, at the end of session and at the very end there was a trailer bill. It was a Department of Local Government Finance bill that did roll, but Kate may know more about this than me. But I know that there were a few kind of tweaks. So Senate Bill 1 got passed in the middle of the night, like a week before session. It was like 12 in the morning or something crazy. But then in the final hours of session, there was another bill that Please explain. But it kind of rolled back some of the business personal property tax exemptions, and because there were concerns, especially about what the effect on locals was going to be, local governments. And so that was one of the pieces they kind of rolled that back to say, okay, we're going to soften the blow for now. We got to see, like Kate said, we have to see this play out a little bit before we go all in on those exemptions.
Yeah, I think you were pretty spot on with that. It was focused on business personal property tax, which in one iteration of the bill, they would have just completely gotten rid of business personal property tax, which is tax on like equipment, not inventory, but anything that a business owns for their operations.
Yeah, like we have like a ton of computers.
Yeah,
for example.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like for a major manufacturer, that's a really big deal. But the cap is still they're going to raise the cap significantly to $2 million. So like if you're a big, machiner or you have a lot of machinery, like for example, the steel mills up north. So they are really
or an assembly line. Let's say I make cars. Yeah, that's a lot.
And that cap is currently like $80,000. It's going up to $2 million. Yeah.
So that is going to happen.
Yes. It's going to be phased in.
Yes.
Okay.
Which that was one of the changes too. They're not going to go immediately to raising the cap. It's going to be it's going to raise a little more slowly than I think was originally kind of being proposed. Or like Kate said, like just get rid of it all to take some of the caps and stuff away altogether.
I do want to go back to one thing about renters is that one topic of conversation that's come up with this bill is that it's shifting the tax burden, the overall tax burden from property owners in part to also working people. And that's what we're doing with the local income tax. So that's where the renters kind of come in, where renters typically are, not all renters are low income, but are typically working people. They have a job. They're already paying property taxes. They may or may not see their rent go down, but they're also going to be paying more in income tax if the local income tax rate goes up. So those people could see a higher tax burden out of all of this. But like I said, grandma who's in her house will see lower property taxes. So people with more limited income will, who are, have a limited income, are living in their home, are retired, will see, they won't have to pay that income tax if it goes up.
Yeah, she'll just have to worry about the Social Security cliff coming up.
Yeah. And Medicare and all that.
Okay, that's fine. We are a business journal. Let's stick with business for a second and talk about the Indiana Economic Development Corp. This is the state agency charged with helping attract businesses to Indiana and helping businesses that already are here, helping them to grow. Typically does this through tax credits, workforce training programs, grants, resources for entrepreneurs. Public infrastructure is a big deal, talent attraction. It has increasingly faced backlash from voters and lawmakers over what they would call a secretive approach to economic development efforts like the Limitless Exploration / Advanced Pace Innovation District, which we call LEAP, in Lebanon. For example, IEDC very quietly acquired control of thousands of acres of land in the Lebanon area for the district. There are other elements of the IEDC's activities and projects that are pretty much under wraps. You can't get information about them. In his campaign for governor, Mike Braun made increasing transparency at IEDC a major plank of his platform. What did the legislature try to address and then eventually pass for the IEDC?
I think that there's several parts to this question because I expected the IEDC and that transparency component to be a much larger piece of this session. But I think with this new administration and Governor Braun definitely saying that this is something that he's interested in, lawmakers that I talked to said that this is something that they kind of want to put on the back burner and say, okay, let's see what they are able to do in their first year and see what type of transparency types of initiatives they can do, which we'll get to, one major one that they did in a second. But let's see what they can do in this first year and see whether legislation is required. See if we need to codify some of these, improvements to transparency. Two major things that they did do. Both related, I think, are inspired by LEAP. There's new land reporting requirements. So if the IEDC, decides to do another LEAP district somewhere else in the state, they are going to have to go through a process of reporting and telling a county, hey, we're going to buy all this land, going through an approvals process, making sure that the public is aware. So that is one big new layer of oversight that they're going to have to abide by. And number two is something that we definitely saw coming, but large water withdrawals are going to have a regulation process. It's the first set of water regulations our state has had for water quantity. This is definitely in response to the IEDC seeking to take water from Wabash River aquifers and pipe it to the LEAP district when it was found that district does not have enough water to support the large intensive industry that it wants to support.
Yeah, and I would assume also to in advance of the many data centers that have either been planned or that are seeking land in Indiana. Some of them require a ridiculous amount of water. I'm sorry, I'm sort of editorializing. A lot.
Oh,
capital
it's a lot.
L amount of water per day.
Well,
for cooling purposes or what have you. And of course, major manufacturers also always need a lot of water.
Yeah, and we'll see. That's one thing that we're going to see with the Braun administration. We don't know how much of an emphasis that Governor Braun will have on those types of industries. I know he's very interested in life sciences and has touted the achievements of the prior administration, but it's still kind of to be determined how much he's going to be going after those types of companies, whether the IEDC will be offering as much as they were previously.
Certainly, though, I mean, there's at least one significant one. They're not all insignificant. One very important legislator who has said, I will take as many data centers as I can possibly get.
I think that was Speaker of the House.
Might have been Speaker of the House.
But yeah, so data centers have definitely been under the microscope just a bit this session. They both passed, tax incentives for them or expanding tax incentives for them. But then I also have looked into, I can't remember if this was passed, but they have definitely had a conversation about, utility consumption. And that was something that Governor Braun talked a lot about on the campaign trail where, are we protecting our environment and having a plan for these utilities? And we saw a few weeks ago that Braun said that he's going to direct that Braun said that he is going to have a state water management plan to be conducted by the state. So that will definitely guide how the state goes forward with economic development because more and more these industries are water intensive and you can't just plop a chip manufacturer in the middle of a desert without any water source because it's that intensive.
Do I have this right? The bill that had a lot of this stuff wrapped into it established an Office for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, which would assume oversight of certified technology parks, which currently is an IEDC responsibility.
So we can talk more about the IEDC and kind of some of the losses that they had this session, but that's I wouldn't necessarily categorize this as a loss for the IEDC, but it's definitely going to pull some of their programs. The funding for this office is going to be taken from the IEDC, which the IEDC from this budget session is losing 25% of their funding. Most of that funding actually came from the last budget passed before we got that $2 billion shortfall forecast to the final budget. So most of that funding was cut in that last week.
That was my impression, was that we saw a lot of cuts there in the last couple of days, and one of them was for IEDC. And when the rubber hit the road there in the biennium budget, they lost about 25% of their budget.
Yes. But to go back to the office.
Yeah.
So this new office, it's going to be funded with about $1 million a year. That doesn't include any programs that they're going to house underneath. TBD on what they're going to house. It could be, like the innovation development districts as well. They'll be underneath because that's codified. But also, we could see like grant programs, startups, potentially the partnership with Elevate Ventures. Who knows? But there's going to be some things that are shifted from the IEDC into this new entity. And the reason for that, because some people have called this IEDC 2.0. Why are we making two versions of the same thing? What Governor Braun has said is that this will be consolidating resources into one space where entrepreneurs and small business owners can go to, if I have a small business question, I can go there. Whereas in the IEDC is wide-reaching in some ways where they are saying it might get caught up in the process. So really it's hoping to be a touch point for this. Governor Braun has said he wants to focus on entrepreneurs and small business. This is basically the, way that he's going to do that.
A couple of postscripts on IEDC, not necessarily related to the legislation, but the governor has ordered the Indiana Economic Development Foundation, which works hand in hand with the IEDC, to disclose its benefactors and file regular financial disclosures, which it hadn't been doing. The foundation's role has included things like paying for virtually all of the international travel for prior governors on economic development trips, which under Holcomb were really significant.
Yeah, and I asked before he was elected, I asked Governor Braun, do you plan on taking economic development trips? And he was like, no, I think I'll stay stateside for a while. I think he said he had to mind the shop for a while before considering taking those trips.
The governor's office announced 2 weeks ago that it is hiring an outside firm to produce an independent audit of the IEDC's spending and accounts. There's a related organization, I believe an organization that was spawned by IEDC called LA Ventures, that they're in particular interested in figuring out where money has gone. And that is an incredibly complicated issue that I guarantee you we're going to cover, but we are a good hour into this. So we're going to get close to wrapping things up. You look like you want to say something.
I have one quick comment on that. I will say that with the audit and with all of the conversation about economic development this year, we didn't see a lot of legislation, but I think this sets us up to have a larger conversation about that next year. Which parameters are needed, it'll be, they'll return and the audit will have been completed. And I know for a fact, Senator Deary has told me many times that he plans to bring that legislation back this year that to add some more of those transparency measures to the IEDC. And he's been a big proponent of that because his district is impacted. So I do think that this sets up next year as maybe the big year where we're talking about IEDC transparency and maybe setting up more of those guardrails. It'll also be Governor Braun's second legislative session. This session, also something to note, Braun was inaugurated after lawmakers had already returned to the State House. So a lot of these things, Governor Braun kind of just jumped into session. So there wasn't a lot of preparation where maybe we'll see some of those these more thought out ideas come to fruition next year.
Thank you guys so much. Wow. I feel like I learned a lot here. And I will try to have everybody back. My thanks again to Kate Sharon, Daniel Lee, and Casey Smith. Kate has more coverage of the legislative session's effect on businesses on the front page of the latest edition of IBJ. And folks, before you get on with the rest of your week, there are a few other stories I want to bring to your attention. First up, more IndyCar teams are choosing to locate headquarters in the Indianapolis area, and some of their young drivers have followed suit. Does that give them a home field advantage in the Indy 500? IBJ's Taylor Wooten has more on where the drivers on the grid are coming from. Also in this week's issue, Daniel Lee reports on the efforts to reignite interest in scouting in central Indiana. And Daniel Bradley explains why fire departments are paying more for fire trucks that are taking years to deliver. Again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at ibj.com. Now, I will tell you, it is quite a bit easier to access all of the latest business news and all of IBJ's data on Central Indiana's business community and economy if you're a subscriber. We're running a promotion right now that gives you complete access for $1 per week for 3 months, just to get a sense of how valuable and original our content is. Just go to ibj.com and click on the subscribe button. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hi again there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.
Get ready for full throttle coverage as we shift into high gear for Business at the Brickyard, presented by LiUNA with support from the City of Westfield and Daniel's Family Vineyard and Winery. We're giving you the inside track on the powerful connection between motorsports and the Indiana economy. Join us at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for exclusive interviews, behind-the-scenes access, and the stories that drive the business of motorsports. So buckle up and join us for Emmy Award-winning Business at the Brickyard coverage all month long.